Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Livia Boscardin. I'm a sociologist at the University of Basel in Switzerland. My pronouns are she and her. So I first want to thank the Collegio Carlo Alberto, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm very happy to be here. And I welcome you all to my presentation on the Livestock Revolution. Before I start, I would like to dedicate my presentation to Antonio, Francisco, and a second Antonio. Kind of 2 months ago, this group of friends intervened when once more police controlled people on the streets of Turin who did not really look Italian because they were black. Antonio, Francisco, and Antonio were then arrested for having impeded law enforcement officers while they were engaged in the performance of their official duties. So these three persons are since May detained in the prison delle Vallette here in Turin in really abhorrible conditions. The cells are full of bugs and mice, and the roofs are leaking, etc. I mean, prison is always horrible and wrong, but this is like another injustice inflicted upon them. And to protest the prison industrial complex, and their specific conditions, Antonio Batali is on hunger strike since last Wednesday. So yeah, I would like to ask you to show them your solidarity. You can write them letters, or you can also kind of join the protests against their detention. You find all the updates on the homepage that I put here on the slide, on the blog Macerie. Okay. So when I was thinking about what I could present at the Carlo Alberto Law Seminar, I studied the program of the spring and summer term, 2017, and I realized that there was one single issue that kind of summed up the whole semester. So in the past months, you have heard talks about the crisis, about hunger, about food, social movements, GMO, etc. And so I thought, well, there is this one issue that sums up all those topics, and that was the Livestock Revolution. Very coincidentally, I just submitted my own PhD thesis on the very same issue, and yes, I'm glad to be here. But you might ask yourself, what exactly is the Livestock Revolution, right? I don't know if some of you are familiar with the term. You might have heard of the Green Revolution in agriculture, which took place in the 1960s, and the term Green Revolution in agriculture designates a big increase in agricultural yields, mainly due to chemical inputs in agriculture. So basically, the Livestock Revolution means that global livestock consumption will roughly double by 2015. The term has been coined in a joint discussion paper by 3 international institutions, the first being the International Food Policy Research Institute, the second International Livestock Research Institute, and the third one, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And they wrote this discussion paper in 1999. Fair enough. But still, I mean, why should we even care about that, right? About a discussion paper or about this strange livestock revolution. How is the livestock revolution then linked to the topics of the seminar? How is it linked to social movements, food, hunger, GMO, the crisis, etc.? So it is linked, and it matters because global livestock production emits more greenhouse gases than the global transport sector. You see here a picture illustrating global warming. It is the #1 driver of species extinction. That's why I put this very cute lemur here in the slide. And it's also the biggest land user on Earth. And this land use is entangled with the violent displacement and expropriation of indigenous peoples, of peasants around the globe, which has, of course, also sparked social uprisings, for instance, in Brazil. So I was just debating the question of how the Livestock Revolution is linked to the Carlo Alberto Law Seminar. And my final point on GMO was that the Livestock Revolution heavily relies on genetically modified soy and corn for fodder. And of course, it contributes to the social crisis, as it can be linked to both over and under nutrition. So this was my little teaser, or to kind of elucidate the link to the Carlo Alberto Law Seminar. And I would also like to clarify my own academic background. and situate myself and clarify my position, where I'm coming from. So my background is in environmental sociology, which might also be a new field for some of you. Environmental sociology is very much like environmental studies or ecology, but with a social sciences perspective. So for those of you who cannot really imagine what environmental sociology might be, environmental sociology analyzes the relationship between human society and nature, but also, and perhaps even more fundamentally, it studies how humans conceptualize nature or the environment in the first place, right? So a typical field of research is, for instance, the effect of environmental catastrophes on different social groups. One example is the disproportionate damage suffered by black communities during the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. We see here a tag on this fridge that says racism plus classism equals Katrina. So this is a sign for us that environmental issues always have lots to do with power, with societal hierarchies and oppression, etc. Another topic dealt with in environmental sociology are different feelings or values towards nature, for instance, from people with different educational backgrounds or of different genders. And yet another subject are environmental movements, like environmental social movements. Here are some pictures from the protest against the climate summit in Paris 2 years ago. Or you also have the movement of nudists. Here a picture of a winterproof group that has been spotted in Switzerland 3 years ago. Why not? Within environmental sociology then there is another subfield which is called sociological human-animal studies, and now we're getting closer to the core of the issue. So human-animal studies examine the societal relationship with animals. This relationship, as you can see here in all those pictures, manifests itself in a variety of ways. And this variety implies that our relationship with non-human animals is not just purely biological, but it's a highly social one, and as such is full of ambivalence and contradictions. Perhaps the most crucial role non-human animals play in our society, culture, and economy is their role as commodities, as food, right? As so-called livestock, literally living stock. And therefore our focus today on the so-called Livestock Revolution. That's for my academic background. Now I would like to include a short reflection on objectivity and positionality. We all know that knowledge is situated and that there is nothing such as neutral knowledge or objective knowledge. And so that's why I want to make my standpoint explicit. So I'm a white, able-bodied cis woman. I come from a relatively privileged financial or economic background. I have a Swiss passport and can hence travel and work freely almost around the world. And all privilege is ignorant at its core, so I'm happy if you challenge me and my beliefs. For my PhD thesis on the Livestock Revolution, I scrutinized around 100 documents on the revolution that have been issued by international institutions such as the FAO or the International Livestock Research Institute. And I performed a discourse analysis, and while performing this analysis, my aim was always to question the current social order and to highlight its contingency. So I asked, why does our world look like this, and could it be otherwise, right? With my thesis and also with this presentation, I'd like to contribute to so-called counter-storytelling, and the revolutionary anti-authoritarians of color define counter-storytelling as, I quote, writing that aims to cast doubt on the validity of accepted premises or myths, especially ones held by the majority. The decolonial Peruvian scholar Quijano calls that epistemological decolonization. And then such counter-storytelling can perhaps eventually serve as an intellectual foundation for social or food justice or environmentalist initiatives. And one last final clarification on my use of words and terminology. In my presentation, I will use the words majority and minority world. to denote so-called developing and developed countries. So the minority world stands for so-called developed countries and the majority world for developing countries. This terminology has been created by the Bangladeshi scholar Alam, and he wanted to replace the traditional Eurocentric, colonial, or otherwise unsatisfactory terms used like developing developed or global south and global north. Alam wanted to highlight that people living in so-called developing countries constitute the majority of humankind, and he wanted to define this majority in terms of what it has instead of what it lacks. And supposedly, this majority lacks development. So this was my last disclaimer. Now let's move on to the outline of my talk. I will speak for about 55 minutes. We're already past the introduction on my research, my academic background, and my positionality. Second, then, to understand the Livestock Revolution, I would like to give an overview over the animal industry and its environmental consequences. Third, then, we delve into the subject matter of the Livestock Revolution. Fourth, we scrutinize how the Livestock Revolution can actually be achieved. Fifth, I conclude, and then we have around 35 minutes left for your questions and discussion. Okay, so the animal industry or the animal industrial complex. Instead of the animal industry, I sometimes use the term animal industrial complex. This term has been coined by an anthropologist, Barbara Noske, and it has been later also been defined by the sociologist Richard Twine, and he defines it as, I quote, a partly opaque and multiple set of networks and relationships between the corporate agricultural sector, governments, and public and private science. With economic, cultural, social, and affective dimensions, it encompasses an extensive range of practices, technologies, images, identities, and markets, end quote. From my perspective as a minority world resident in the early 21st century, the animal industrial complex is embedded in financial interests and primarily serves as a capitalist enterprise. Accordingly, the overall purpose of the animal industrial complex is neither the production of food nor the satisfaction of basic human needs, but rather the maximization of profits. So in a nutshell, the animal industry does not aim to produce food, but to make money. In history, and actually throughout different cultures, the words livestock and wealth are etymologically linked. The most basic example is the word capital. So capital stems from the Latin word capita, designating heads of cattle, and capita is the plural of the word caput, head, and capita was used to designate just heads of cattle. So there is a historic consistency to understand farmed animals as wealth or as capital and not necessarily as food. Now let's have a look at some numbers. The most important figure to keep in mind for you, I guess, is that every year around 70 billion land animals are slaughtered for food, or perhaps rather for profit, right? This is almost 10 times the human population, and until now we've only talked about land animals. Every year around 3 trillion aquatic individuals are killed. This number is difficult to determine because those fish, etc., are only counted in tons of catch and not in individual beings. What about 50 years ago? Here we see a slide showing the evolution of meat consumption per capita from 1961 to 2012. And in the very beginning, in 1961, 8 billion land animals have been killed. And now, around 50 years later, this number has arisen to 70 billion land animals killed, right? Which is roughly 9 times more. At the same time, the human population roughly tripled. If you look at the graphs, big increases in meat consumption took place in the US, in Argentina, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Brazil, etc. And then also China. And of course, China makes a big difference because of its vast population. In China, actually, meat consumption has increased more than tenfold in those past 50 years. Perhaps the country statistics also give a more detailed picture. We have the world mean of 42 kilos of meat that are consumed yearly per capita by a world inhabitant, right? That's the global mean. And then a US citizen consumes around 118 kilograms a year. In Italy, it's 87. South America, 78. China, it's around half the US consumption, right? Africa, an African citizen or somebody living on the continent of Africa consumes 19 kilos a year, and India is kind of the very bottom of those statistics, consumes 4 kilos a year per capita. So we see that the geography of meat is highly unequal. And then, of course, we have big disparities on a global, regional, national, etc. level. On a global level, the minority world consumes roughly 3 times as much meat as the majority world. And on a more individual level, the disparities in meat consumption follow cultural, class, religious, racial, and gendered lines, etc. What then were the enabling factors for such a huge increase in animal production in the past decades? So one very important factor is animal genetics and technology. Nowadays, only a few breeding corporations control the genetic material of all animals used as livestock. These breeds are the result of decades of selection processes, and the breeds are highly productive. They gain weight in a very short amount of time, and they have a high so-called feed conversion rate. Generally, these breeds are prone to diseases. They are administered all sorts of pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, also depending on the country and legislation, sexual and growth hormones, etc. Beautiful example is the individual that you see here on the left. That's a cow of the breed Belgian Blue, and this breed has a natural mutation, a natural genetic mutation, and they lack an enzyme that inhibits muscle growth, so they kind of produce double the muscle mass. This map, I guess, here is also instructive. It's from the Heinrich Böll Foundation and Friends of the Earth Europe Meat Atlas. I can highly recommend this book. You can download it for free online as a PDF document. So the map shows the presence of Holstein Friesian dairy cattle and of a large white pig, which are 2 very productive breeds. And actually, those unique breeds can be found almost all over the globe. But perhaps the most important trend in the animal industry, as perhaps everywhere in agriculture, is corporate consolidation and intensification. The technical term for such intensive animal factories or factory farms is CAFO, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. Worldwide, the percentage of meat that is being produced in such intensified circumstances is around 80%. In the US, it's more or less like 99%. In Italy, it might be around 80%. What I found about Italy at the first glance is that the number of farms declined by 70% from 2000 to 2010, so within a decade. The number of farms really significantly declined, while the total number of animals did not decrease, right? And in contrast, the number of animals per farm increased in the same period of time. This development of intensification and corporate consolidation also shakes the majority world, not only the minority world. For instance, in the Philippines, in 2005, 80% of the broiler market was controlled by 6 corporations that were unified in one association. So one association controls 80% of the broiler market in the Philippines. Yeah. And then to also have perhaps the fate of animals in mind, the existence of those farmed animals that are kept in such CAFOs is marked by being crammed into very small confinements, by chronic diseases, self-mutilation, depression, etc. Most of those animals never see the light of day. And in general, animals in the food industry are reduced to mere biomachines. They have to produce a maximum amount of output, be it their eggs or their flesh or their milk, etc., with a minimum of input being feed or antibiotics. Next to corporate consolidation, intensification, and technology, the astonishing boom in livestock production was also enabled and fostered by government subsidies. In the European Union, subsidies totaled $190 per cow in 2014. So every individual cow in the European Union kind of received $190 in subsidies in 1 year. In China, a figure for the pig sector is that every individual pig raised in China has gotten $47 in subsidies in 1 year, in 2012. And without those exorbitant subsidies, the industry would actually be slacking. Also, such financial incentives are significantly higher for animal production than for plant-based production, be it vegetable or fruit production. The industry was and is also fostered by tax benefits, by exemptions from environmental regulations. It is fostered by national school programs, be it like lunch programs or school break programs. Perhaps you yourself have also, as a child in primary school, have heard of like a glass of milk a day that was given to you at school, stuff like that. And then this boom also relied on the so-called supermarket revolution, like the spread of supermarkets that made meat and other animal products available to the masses on a daily basis in the first place. Well, this massive increase in livestock production in the past 5 to 6 decades had an enormous environmental impact. Start with climate change. The animal industry is responsible for in between 14.5 and 51% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and even the conservative estimate by the FAO of 14.5 emissions is bigger than the global emissions of the transport sector, and it's also bigger than the yearly emissions of the United States of America. What are the sources of emission? That's a figure from the FAO 2013 report tackling climate change through livestock, which you can also find online. So the biggest source of emission is feed production and processing. The second biggest source of emission is enteric fermentation from ruminants. This sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually just a digestive process of ruminants, so of cattle. They emit a lot of methane. Then 10% can be attributed to manure, storage and processing, and only a small remainder is due to transport and processing of animal products, which is, I think, surprising, because we have this discourse of to consume local meat, etc., but actually transport doesn't play such a big role. When you think of biodiversity loss, the animal industry is the largest driver of species extinction and biodiversity loss, mainly due to land use change and deforestation for be it pasture or crop fields. More than 70% of Amazon deforestation can be attributed to the animal industrial complex. The industry also consumes around a third of global freshwater resources, while in the next 10 years, around 2 billion people will suffer from water shortages, and of course, again, mainly in the majority world. Why does the industry use so much water? Here we have a slide with the water footprint of common foodstuffs. So if we look at the first line, beef, to produce 1 kilogram of beef, more than 15,000 liters of water are needed. If we look at pig meat, so-called pork, one needs around 6,000 liters. For chicken, it's more than 4,000 liters. For dairy and listed cheese, so you need around 3,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of cheese. A glass of milk, which is a quarter liter, needs around 250 liters. A kilo of bread also needs a particular amount of water, 1,600 liters. But then crops like potatoes are much less water intensive, so a kilogram of potatoes needs 287 liters, or tomatoes need 214 liters of water. So the production of animal protein, just in general, is very water intensive, right? And next to this big waste of water, the industry is also a top polluter of rivers, streams, and the ocean, contributing to ocean acidification. As for land use, I raised this issue already in the teaser, in the introduction. The industry occupies an incredible amount of land. It occupies 45% of global terrestrial surface, which is almost half the terrestrial surface of the planet, right? It uses 80% of agricultural land on Earth. And as I said before, this appropriation of land has not been a particularly peaceful process. Mainly indigenous lands, or small-scale farmers' lands have been appropriated by the animal industrial complex, and people then have been displaced, etc., just to convert their land into crop fields or into pasture to graze cattle, for instance. Linked to this land use is, as I said, of course, feed production. And nowadays, around 35% of the global grain harvest directly go into feed throws. And this grain harvest is so harvested wheat, barley, oats, rye, etc., and also corn. And all those cereals could also be eaten by humans, right? That's not something that only non-human animals can eat. Could be perfectly be eaten by humans. And for barley, the statistics is particularly surprising. 85% of the global harvest are eaten by farmed animals, which is almost all of the harvest, right? I haven't spoken about soy, because soy is not a grain, but an oil seed. Around 80% of global soy production end up in feed throws. And, well, if we consider all those numbers, we should also consider that around 1 billion people on the globe are malnourished. Nevertheless, we have to consider that already today enough food would be produced to feed the whole world. And what we perhaps also have discussed in the previous lecture on hunger. Hunger is not only a problem of production, but a very complex problem of distribution, a result of different natural, economic, political, cultural factors, etc. So hunger is a highly political issue. Still, I'd like to compare the use of grains for biofuels versus the use of grains for animal feed, because biofuels are a very controversial issue, and I guess rightfully so, right? But I think if we talk about, or if we problematize the use of grains for biofuels, we should also look at animal feed. Because if we use cheap and healthy food, like grains, to produce then a commodity, kind of an expensive commodity for a social elite or for the wealthy, I think that's problematic. And that's actually the case when we use grain for animal feed. So if we look at wheat production in 2012, 16% of global production has been used for animal feed, while less than 1% of global production has been used for biofuels. For corn, 60% of global production of corn in 2009 has ended up in feed throws, while 16% of global corn harvest has been used for biofuels. I know that also sugarcane is, of course, a very important resource to produce biofuels. I haven't included sugarcane in these statistics, but I mean, corn, I think the comparison is still telling, right? And also, what is also worth considering is that the production of biofuels is often linked to the animal industrial complex, because often, for instance, rainforest is cleared to first produce crops for animal feed, and then this cleared land is then used to produce biofuel. So animal production often paves the way for biofuel production. And finally, if we look at general production efficiency, and efficiency is here determined in the necessary amount of water, land, and energy per calorie, then this production efficiency is much higher for plant-based calories than for animal-based calories. So it's around 4 to 20 times higher. But of course, thinking about the term efficiency, in capitalism, efficiency is not determined by the efficient satisfaction of basic human needs, but rather in the efficient generation of profit. And so, of course, if production is geared to the wealthy, towards those who can pay, then of course that is efficient, like in a capitalist mindset, because you make more money, and you can't really make money out of the hungry. With all those things in mind, now I want to move on to the Livestock Revolution, and I know this was kind of a long introduction, but I deem it vital to also understand the breadth of the Livestock Revolution. So, to repeat, the Livestock Revolution stands for an almost doubling in the demand for animal products by 2050. It's actually an increase of around 70%. And international institutions project that especially the majority world is, quote-unquote, catching up with their consumption of animal protein. According to the projections, this rise in consumption is due to population growth, but also to the formation of a new middle class and urbanization. So in sum, the Livestock Revolution is said to be a demand-led revolution. That's important, so it's said to be demand-led. On this slide, you see the relationship between gross domestic product and meat consumption. You have one outlier again, or one very distinct outlier, India. You also have other outliers, but yeah. So the argument that is built by the FAO, by the International Livestock Research Institute and the International Food Policy Research Institute is that with rising GDP, meat consumption also increases. The bulk of the rise in demand by 2050 will presumably be met by industrial systems, so by those CAFOs that we have been introduced to before. That's also why the authors of this initial discussion paper of 1999 frame the Livestock Revolution as, I quote, one of the largest structural shifts to ever affect food markets in developing countries, end quote. As for the species involved, the Livestock Revolution will be a monogastric revolution, kind of a poultry and pig revolution. In contrast, demand for ruminant meat is said to be on a decline. Why? The monogastric sector can be easily mechanized, especially chickens or small animals. You can pack them up in large quantities on little space. They emit less greenhouse gases, and they have this high feed conversion rate. In contrast to the boom in the majority world, and in the projected boom in the majority world, meat consumption in the minority world remains on an all-time high, as you can see here on those graphs, but it is, in contrast to the majority world, rather stagnating. Is there an explanation for that? So reasons might be that the demand is just satiated, right? People consume enough, or perhaps, well, they actually consume too much animal protein that is deemed healthy, actually, but they don't want to consume more animal protein. They can't consume more. So this could be one explanation. Or there have been repeated food scandals and fear of zoonosis, if you think of the BSE crisis or the bird flu. Then one might say there is a new consciousness about health, environmental protection, animal welfare, and so on. So more and more plant-based or vegan food becomes fashionable. But in any case, as those graphs are said to be aligning, the FAO and other institutions speak of a so-called dietary convergence or of a nutrition transition. So the transition is away from plant-based food towards a diet which is heavy in animal protein, in fat, sugar, salt, and alcohol and processed foods in general. So this would be the nutrition transition to this kind of Western diet. So in a nutshell, in this mindset, a traditional society is characterized by a low intake of animal protein, and a so-called modern society is characterized by a high intake of animal protein. The Livestock Revolution and this nutrition transition are deemed inexorable, inevitable evolutions in the course of human development and modernization. In sociology and in environmental sociology, this reminds us of so-called modernization theory, which was a development theory in the 1960s. Modernization theory presupposes a kind of linear development of all human societies from the traditional society to high mass consumption of a modern society with a takeoff stage, etc. But the goal is to kind of reach the modern Eurocellular Euro society. The theory is kind of outdated, but it's still somehow lurking in development discourse, in development studies, etc. So not only is the Livestock Revolution seen as inevitable in this model of global society, it's also framed to be beneficial. It's said to be crucial for food security and also for poverty eradication. And that's really interesting. So the Livestock Revolution is said to be, I quote, a rare opportunity for smallholder farmers to benefit from a rapidly growing market. These authors state that livestock is one of the rare markets the poor have actually access to, right? That's the hegemonic discourse. But I would say we have to be cautious when we hear that something is justified by it being natural. If we go back to the beginning of my presentation and back to the Hurricane Katrina and the damage suffered by black communities, we've seen the consequences of the Hurricane Katrina were not just natural, right? Because it did not affect all the inhabitants of New Orleans in the same manner. In history, violent power relationships have been legitimized by them being natural, holy, authorized by a greater God, by a greater power, like God, etc. If you think of racism, slavery, sexism, and patriarchy, things like that, right? So if something is being described as natural, this should really alert us to scrutinize the issue a bit more in depth. The same can be said for the Livestock Revolution. And indeed, there is a critique of this hegemonic, naturalizing discourse. And this critique goes, when we go back to our kind of long introduction to the animal industrial complex, the high intake of animal protein in the minority world only emerged after the Second World War, right? So in the past, like 50 and 60 years. This means that this is a very recent development. If you think of human history, 50 to 60 years is a very recent development, and it also took place for a small part of human society, right? For a minority part. Hence, in a distinct place at a distinct time. So globally and historically, such a diet is an exception and not the norm. Therefore, I would criticize the notion of a so-called convergence of diets, as claimed by the FAO, and I would rather say that this development of the Livestock Revolution is an adaptation to the extreme outlier of the minority world civilization. In this so-called convergence of diets, local specificities, cultural traditions, etc., all over the world are simply erased, as if they wouldn't exist. But, following this critique, if there is nothing natural about the Livestock Revolution, what then are the drivers of the boom in livestock consumption and production that we can actually witness? So, this boom, I would say, was not a natural occurrence at all, but the outcome of different political, economic, cultural factors, technological factors, etc. On the one hand, meat consumption is indeed a status symbol. It stands for so-called Western society, for modernity, also for masculinity, etc. It's a sign of success. But on the other hand, We have all the factors that we mentioned before, intensification of production, corporate consolidation, tax exemptions, and enormous subsidies for animal farming, the externalization of environmental and social costs, so-called supermarket revolution, and so on. But what also comes into play is that the minority world, as the demand, domestic demand is rather stagnating, right, needs new markets. So demand all over the world is actually being created. For example, in India, a traditionally vegetarian country. In India, in particular, chicken consumption is on the rise. So corporations and nations of the minority world are exporting not only their commodities, for instance, frozen chicken wings, to different African countries, they also export know-how, technology, and whole facilities to the majority world. Now we're coming to part 4 of my presentation. How actually should the livestock revolution be brought about? Seems like a huge endeavor. So the livestock revolution is promoted by the animal industry, by different lobbies, and also by governments. Some of the most important actors are currently united in an international coalition, which is called the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. Here you see a screenshot of the homepage of the Global Agenda for Sustainable